Hey, Malcolm, you know that Audible's got a lot more than audiobooks?
Of course, podcasts,
Originals,
bestsellers,
future bestsellers,
sleep stories.
sleep story. What are you talking about, sleep story? Malcolm. Oh, wow. Malcolm. Malcolm. Hey, no, Roxy. Hey, Roxy, get out of Malcolm's house.
The most inspiring minds, the most compelling stories, all in one place. Audible.
Greetings. I'm Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter, professor of sociology at UCLA, author of 3 books, creator of the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and your host for today's panel. Thank you everyone for tuning in to the 26th annual Festival of Books and our virtual event, The Black Experience Across Genres. Today, we'll be joined by S.A. Cosby, Anthony Award-winning writer, best-selling author, and LA Times Book Prize finalist for Black Top Wasteland. Danielle Evans, winner of PEN America PEN Robert W. Bingham Prize, Hurston Wright Legacy Award, Patterson Prize, and Book Prize finalist for the Office of Historical Corrections. Nikki Finney, author of 5 books of poetry, winner of the National Book Award for Poetry, and LA Times Book Prize finalist for Love Child's Hotbed of Occasional Poetry. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, Robert Jones Jr., best-selling author, creator of the social justice, social media community, Son of Baldwin, and debut author of The Prophets. Please remember to support your local independent bookstores during the festival. Signed book plates for all of these authors are available through BookSoup. S.A., Daniel, Nikki, and Robert, welcome. Peace and blessings. It is so beautiful to see you all and to be a part of this award-winning and legendary panel already. I always want to start in the words of the great sociologist, Queen Latifah, shout out to East Orange, New Jersey, ladies first, ladies first. So I'm going to start my first question just by asking about Blackness. This is about Blackness across genre. But what occurred to me in reading each of your work is the love of Black people. And so I want to pass it over to Nikki and ask, you know, how is the love of Black people guiding you in this work and perhaps all of your work?
Love of Black people. Well, first of all, hey, everybody. Good to be with you. I'm sorry, I'm jumping in because he said Blackness and love. And I was like, wait, that's my train. I got to get on that. Blackness and love guides me every day. Every time I am blessed to open my eyes and start a new day. This is this new book, Love Child's Hotbed of Occasional Poetry, is filled with love stories, and it's filled with stories of being Black in the South, growing up in the 60s and the 1970s. And so it's my North Star. You know, if I am never lost, I am never away from it. It is always up in the sky. All I have to do is lift my eyes to see where I am, where my people have always been, where my grandmother stood, where my great-great-grandpeople, what they had to do in order to live and survive and put a book in my hand and hug me. And Blackness is alive and well and protected and nurtured in hopefully everything that I touch with a pencil.
It surely is, Danielle.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I'm always thinking about in my work is necessarily how many layers Black people have to have in this country, and where I can get to the layers that feel least performed, where I can give people space in my stories to be the most honest version of themselves, and where I have to be aware of all of the reasons that they can't. And so I think that I'm always thinking about the gulf between the sort of external self and the internal self, and I'm always thinking about what shapes that. And one of the ways I'm thinking about that is in terms of all the structural things that make it less possible to be your most honest self, to speak most freely. But I'm also always trying to imagine where the space is where those guards can drop, where the space is where someone doesn't have to code switch anymore, where the space is where people can just be themselves or say what they mean.
That is beautiful. I'll pass it over to Robert.
Yes, Blackness informs everything I say, write, and do. But for me, one of the questions I'm always returning to is, what is Blackness? In a way that's not defined by white supremacy or the white gaze. So even in my work, The Prophets, as I'm asking myself that question, I find it in a time before slavery. I go back to the continent, to a fictitious group of Africans living in a village, living their lives, because I'm trying to answer a question for myself. That is, what does it mean to be Black? Since what we largely know it to be is something that was defined by whiteness, the one-drop rule, or whatever other measures they use to determine that whiteness is pure and Blackness is impure. So I'm looking for a Blackness that isn't defined in that way, that is defined by the strength and the flaws, the humanity and the warlike tendencies, the joy, the pain of my people before we have any contact with anything that wishes to disparage or demean us.
Very well said. Thank you so much. An essay. Lastly, but not leastly, love to hear from you.
For me, my Blackness is my superpower. It's my safety blanket. It's my connection to previous generations. It's my connection to the present. It's everything that I am and everything that I hope to be. It's the joy, the pain, the love, the laughter. It's cookouts on a Saturday evening. It's playing spades. It's going to church. It's HBCUs. It's poetry. It's Nikki Giovanni. It's James Baldwin. It's Richard Wright and Paul Robeson. It's Jack Johnson beating the hell out of Jack Tinney. It's all of that. It's everything that creates this incredible experience that we are blessed to have as Black people in America.
Thank you so much. And I'll just add to that list, is S.A. Cosby, is Danielle Evans, is Nikki Finney, is Robert Jones Jr. In a year where we lost so much and we were chosen to be survivors, I found so much love and joy in your work, each of you. And it is an honor, really, truly, to not only read what you have written, but also to be in conversation with you about this. I want to transition a little bit, and the theme of Black love will carry all the way throughout, because in this season of deep pain, I think one thing that writing is able to do is really hone us in on the joy of life, even when it seems unattainable. And so I want to turn to a discussion of Black music, because oftentimes as writers, we lean on the radio quite literally, or we lean on the stereo, or we lean on some music to really help us do the writing. And also, it finds a way of featuring itself prominently in our work. And so I wanted to come to both essay initially, just to talk about how Black music plays a role in your wonderful novel. You use go-go music. You really hone in on what it means to be from the DMV, as we like to say in the culture, in the Virginia part. And you really hone in on Reverend Al Greene and Warren G, Regulator. I really love to hear what how Black music plays a role in your storytelling. And then I'll pass through the authors going from that question there.
Yeah, thank you. Black music for me, it is a window, it's a bridge that connects generations. It's a window into our existential selves. You talked about Reverend Al Greene. He's a great example of both the sacred and the profane, the spiritual and the flesh in the same person. And for me, that music is a part of my childhood. It's a part of my life. All music in America is Black music, because all music in America is based on Black music, on African beats and drums. Blues gave birth to rock and roll. Gospel gave birth to the blues. Spirituals gave birth to what a lot of people like to call roots music in Americana. And so there is no country music without Black music. There is no Elvis Presley without Sister Rosetta Tharpe. So those things are things that I find joy in. And on a personal note, growing up in the Deep South, growing up in a home that was, we were incredibly poor. We lived in abject poverty, but music gave us joy. My mother recently passed away, but one of my great memories of her is, thank you. But one of my great memories of her is Sunday nights. There was a local radio show that would play the golden oldies. And so me and my brother would have to become antennas. He would hold the radio, and then I would touch him so that we could get this signal so that she could listen to the Golden Oldies show. And so I grew up hearing the music of Gene Chandler and Al Green and the Temptations and Junior Walker and the All-Stars and all that. And I recently, it came to my mind to think about it. I could see my mom swaying side to side in the kitchen with her eyes closed. And it made me think about what that music meant to her. Did she see herself as that young girl that fell in love with my daddy, the big broad-chested fisherman? And did she see herself slow dancing with him in the juke joint? And so for me, in my writing, that Black music is a soundtrack to the experience of my characters. It informs their emotions. It informs their fears, their hopes, their dreams. And it's got a good beat and you can dance to it.
I love that. Thank you so much. And you talking about the playing the oldies, it took me to where I was raised in Philly, and the station is WDAS. And we grew up on it. 105.3 was the station. And one of our most legendary sirens of that era is the one and only Phyllis Hyman, who is featured prominently in your book, Nikki, in a very beautiful, beautiful piece that you did on the occasion of her untimely death. And I just wanted you to share a little insight just about Phyllis Hyman for those in the audience who might need a little bit of education on her genius.
Well, Phyllis Hyman, is one of the sounds of my growing up years. There are many: Curtis Mayfield, James Brown. You can't be Black from South Carolina and not talk about James Brown. But Phyllis Hyman, when I was just leaving home and she was putting out all that amazing, beautiful music, and I left South Carolina going to California to find, another path to be on, she was singing in my ear. And I knew every song and the poetry that she was putting out, the heartfelt love songs and the empathy, the human empathy she was placing in every song was just like, was so important to me. And so I remember getting a call from Essence Magazine when we were all struck by her untimely death, and they were like, "Can you write something for the next issue?" And I don't know, that you're making me understand that my life with writing occasional poetry, really started in my late 20s or being serious about it, because this book is filled with occasional poems, but it started way before now. And I did have something. Somebody had heard me talk about how much her music and the sound of her voice, and you said it, you said siren. She was a love siren. So every time you heard a Phyllis Hyman song, it was a slow drag. You did Blue Lights in the Basement. You did realize that you could heal and nurture, and you grabbed somebody that you weren't supposed to or wanted to, and that was the sound. Angie Bofield, Phyllis Hyman, that was when I was coming up, those were the sounds that they said, oh, this is a slow dance, or a slow drag, I would say. So I wanted to stop the pain that we were all feeling by writing something that perhaps would live on and on and on, which is what maybe some of us always try to do. Is just like, let me write into this moment with as much tenderness and love and respect for this artist as I can.
And you accomplished that beautifully. I mean, I am sure as the ancestor, she is feeling deeply venerated. I love that you even took her last name and used it as a replacement for harmonize and instead referred to as Hymenize because she had her own style. And she was not always slow, as you know. She would throw in a good You Know How to Love Me, which is one of my favorite tracks by her. Little up-tempo, just so you need to shake your hips a little bit. And speaking of up-tempo, this brings me over to Robert, because I see something that we share is a love of all things Miss Janet Jackson. And so I saw that in your acknowledgments, and I thought, you mean it, so it isn't just that it's about, is the youngest Jackson the best Jackson, but instead a thing about how she gave you a sense of freedom that you carried into your writing. So if you want to say a little bit about, I like to say Miss Jackson because I'm nasty, but I would say instead, how is the Black music informing your work? I mean, you have a number of artists who are in there. I just, of course, honed in on her in particular.
Shout out to Janet Jackson, who her Rhythm Nation album really introduced me to a body politic. I was, being Black in America, you can't help but be aware of certain things like racism and things like that, but I didn't think of it as a political object until I listened to Rhythm Nation at the age of 18. And I was like, oh, this is serious. And I have to make a conscious effort to do something to change this. So shout out to Janet. But yes, music played a huge role in the writing of The Prophets, in that music often operates as a time machine. You can listen to certain songs and be taken back to particular periods. You can remember the first time you heard a song, where you were, what you were doing. And so I used music in that way to take me to places that I have never been. I listened to Negro spirituals, to give me that feeling of what it took for us to get over something like antebellum slavery. I listened to Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith and Robert Johnson, to understand our connection to Christianity and why we use that as a site of revolution and strategic liberation. I listened to Mahalia Jackson. And then, bring it on forward to understand things like sensuality and love and just romance. I listened to Janet Jackson and Sade. So yeah, music played a huge role in it. Even if you read some of the lines, some of the sentences in The Prophets, you'll notice it has a particular music or a particular rhythm to it. And that's the influence of all of those people I was listening to: Aretha Franklin, Patti LaBelle, Gladys Knight. All of these people, I was using them to help me to make these sentences do something other than tell us information. I wanted the reader to feel a particular way, feel a dance, feel a rhythm, feel a sound when they were reading these passages. So music, I could not have written this novel without having those artists and that music.
Thank you. And it really comes through the pages. So I love that you pointed out even your phraseology in the work. You can follow it like songs, like it is beautifully written. And this leads me to Danielle. I assumed, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but first, when I got your book, I read the title and I just thought historical corrections. Yes, the truth will be waiting for me in this book. And it immediately took me back to when I got my copy, as it were, but it was digital, of Auntie by Rihanna. And I thought, was Danielle listening to this when she wrote this? Because the way you go after the truth, using something that people would think is not necessarily the pathway, short stories, and you put them together in novella and other stories. And they almost sound, for me, like a historical correction of how people think Black women think, but also reminded me of that feeling of awareness that Rihanna's Auntie gave me. So I just say that to say the same question for you. How is music, informing what we're reading from you?
Yeah, I mean, I do think one of my favorite things about the short story collection as a form is that it does feel like an album, right? It feels like everything is greater than the sum of its parts because everything's kind of talking to each other. You can come at the same question in different ways. You can hear different versions of the same song, or kind of different answers to the same question. And so it's one of the reasons I really like the form. And I really like the form, especially for Black writers, because I think there's so much, I love novelists and poets and nonfiction writers too. I don't mean it like that, but I think there's there's so much in the culture that tries to read Black art reductively, that tries to say, okay, all of it must be pure autobiography or pure polemic or just a sort of transcription of our diaries, right? And so I think that there's something about reading a Black writer short story collection where you can see someone doing a lot of different things or trying on a lot of different voices or juxtaposing things that don't kind of resolve themselves easily, that forces people a little bit to wrestle with craft and give people a little bit of credit for being artists. I will say, I mean, I think in terms of actual musical references, there's a less explicit discussion of music in this book than my first book. And I think partly that's because part of this book is about people who I think are feeling disconnected. There was so much music in my first book, which was so much about adolescence, because I do think, as Robert was just saying, the music is so much tied to time and space and memory. And here I'm writing about a lot of characters who are trying to evade or forget things, or who have found themselves in some situation that doesn't feel like home. And so I think part of why there's less music is there's less tethering them. Also, part of why there's less music is probably just from a practical perspective, is my next book is about a singer and songwriter and performer. And so I've been reading a lot about especially Black women who become kind of iconic. I'm thinking about the way in which, if we think about the women who are the most worshipped by culture as Black women, a lot of them are entertainers, are singers, and it also costs so many of them so much. And so I'm thinking about the space between that worship and that cost. I've been, reading about Josephine Baker and Billie Holiday, and thinking about Rihanna and Beyonce, and thinking about the trajectory between the late 90s and today, and how many women who came onto the scene as teenagers kind of had that child star fall apart thing, and how some of the Black women didn't do that only because we don't know how to treat Black women like children, even though they were children when they started performing. So I've been thinking a lot about celebrity, and because it's, I think, a lot bigger picture way of thinking about that same question of performance I'm always thinking about, but I also think there's something particular about the way that performance and being a singer and being on stage let someone be both the most honest version of themselves and a version of themselves that it sort of costs a lot to be.
That's so insightful. Thank you so very much. I immediately thought of my all-time favorite, just to throw myself in here, the Whitney Elizabeth Houston. So as you said that, I thought, even the kinds of stories that they're allowed to have. For example, we're often told Bessie Smith died when in fact no hospital would take her after her injuries in a car accident. So she effectively, in my view, was killed. So I really appreciate that insight. And I want to take it over into, as I was saying, a season of grief that many of us can identify with, if not before the pandemic, definitely during, and sort of as we near a post-pandemic phase. And what each of you masterfully do is take what is known as pain and flip it on the other side of what Frankie Beverly and Mays refer to as the joy and the pain. And I want to go to Robert first, and then I'm going to go to Nikki, because both of you do this veneration, I think, that is very important, especially in Black culture, of queer Black people, of Black gay people. In your case, Robert, what I love especially is right at the beginning, we're introduced to a Black gay couple we have to root for. And I often think one of the dangers in our culture is that we're not sent a steady diet of how to root for gay people as Black people. How do I see, as a Black straight man, a Black gay man's success as a mirror for what is possible for me? There isn't a diet of that information. And by diet, I mean cultural products, writings, readings. And what I see you doing right at the beginning, a critical intervention where the imagination is already blown up, shattered, and has to be put back together by rooting for Samuel and his partner. So if you could say a bit about the importance of Black love in all of its facets as being a site of veneration and a way to expand our imagination as Black people.
Well, queerness is where we're going to find the radical love. Because if you can find in yourself as a Black person, which, we can talk about whether Blackness is in and of itself queerness, if you can love somebody of the same gender in a nation that is committed to showing how much you hate each other and how much you hate yourself, you have committed the most radical, freeing, liberating act imaginable. And so, because I saw a deficit in this place where there are no Black queer people in antebellum slavery or any time before, I'm looking through the canon trying to find it, and can only find it in maybe tiny references or under the context of sexual assault or rape, but never in the context of love, of consensual, free sex, always in this sort of depraved way. I felt it was my duty to bear witness because there had to be that kind of person, that kind of experience, that kind of love that existed, although erased from the narrative, and I wanted to reinscribe it. So I did a ton of research, could not find much, but did find quite a number of things in the before time, in the time in Africa before colonialism and the Christian missionaries, where our ancestors, their love was so large that there was no need to give homosexuality a separate name. Esther Arma from Ghana, beautiful and wonderful and intelligent artist activist from Ghana, said, if you asked my great-grandparents, what is a homosexual? They would have said to you, we don't know. We don't have this thing here. And you would have walked away as a Westerner thinking, oh, there were no homosexuals in Ghana. Everyone was cisgender and heterosexual. She said, but had you explained to them what you meant by homosexual, they would have said, oh, you mean love. Because they had no need to give it a separate name. It was all love. It was all sex. It was all part of the landscape until Christianity came and said, no, this is sinful. So I wanted to push back against that. I wanted to open up that lens again. I wanted to open up that space again and give room to my ancestors like William Dorsey Swann, who we discovered is the first drag queen America has ever seen, and he was an enslaved man. Give him his room and his name back.
That is beautiful. And I want to go to Nikki because your book, Love Child's Hotbed of Occasional Poetry, Poems, and Artifacts, is dedicated to your Uncle Bobby. And when I read that, it took me back to my Uncle Horace. And part of what I think oftentimes when I think about myself and how I became a professor is exactly like Robert is explaining, that I could tell a story where my straight parents are the protagonists. But I would be doing a disservice to that biography because my Uncle Horace, from age 6 until I was 7.5, every day I came home, he made sure I did my homework. He wore a little smoking robe. He was super fly to me. He reminded me of like the Harlem Renaissance. And one day he never came home. And when I was a kid, we went to the funeral and I was really sad. My Uncle Horace was gone. And I remember he made you do your homework and he made you eat succotash. Those were his two things. And he was just gone. And it wasn't until I was 30 years old that I learned that he had actually died of AIDS back in the 80s. And you do this beautiful dedication to your Uncle Bobby. And you also talk about the tension of Uncle Bobby revealing his partner in your home with your dad, you know, and I would love to hear you say a little bit about why you chose this book for Uncle Bobby and what he's doing for you, has done for you, and what you hope people to learn about him as they read this wonderful book.
Yes. I feel incredibly lucky because I had so many grandmothers. And as many of us know, a grandmother doesn't have to be related to you by blood. She can be related to you by marriage. She can be related to you as the fifth wife of your all kinds of setups in the Black family. So I had many Black grandmothers, but one of those Black grandmothers her name was Hilda Grayson Finney, and she actually lived in Los Angeles during the 60s and the 70s. She was a secretary for the NAACP, and she was at one time married to my father's father, a third marriage. But she had 3 sons, and they were my beloved uncles. One of them wrote for the LA Times, and the other one, Bobby, was a fabulous, incredible, quiet inventor of things. He has patents in his name. He was a photographer, and he was boldly out as a gay man in the 1960s, boldly. But before that, he was drafted to go into the Vietnam War, and he said, I'm not going over there to kill people who did not hurt me, who didn't do anything for me. And he just refused it. And as a result of that, his case for his punishment, he was sent to a Los Angeles doll factory and made to work as in a community environment for a period of time, where he made this black doll that was one of the first black dolls made and sent out into the country, and the name of the doll was Tamu. And I wish I had brought her in here tonight, but anyway, I wanted to talk about his power as an individual, as an outlier. You know, I was drawn as a young Black girl in the South to outliers. My Uncle Bobby was one of them, with his sexuality, with his political beliefs, with his fierce holding on to the truth, no matter what happened. He told me once, I know you're being taught that if you do certain things in the South, lightning will hit you. And I was. In church, they will tell you, if a girl kisses a girl or a boy kisses a boy, lightning will strike. And Uncle Bobby would say, well, sometimes it just got to strike. Sometimes you got to just go with that. You got to know. You will know. He said, niece, you will know what lightning feels like if you go forward with whatever you need. And don't be afraid of the church. Don't be afraid of the Southerners. And don't be afraid of those conservative Black people who loved me, but did not want me out of the box, right? They wanted me to stay in that box. Uncle Bobby was flying out of the box in every part of his life. He was so instrumental in me understanding my own sexuality as I got older. I was like, wait, Uncle Bobby, he just taught me so much that I could hold on to. We all need models. We have to, and sometimes they're in our family, and sometimes they're down the street, and sometimes they're in books. That's why we write, so that the next generation doesn't have to think that we aren't that, or we are that. You know, they have some examples of that in the work that we are producing. So Uncle Bobby had to open this book. It is a book that I wanted to write and couldn't figure out how. And every time I talk to him, and I do talk to him, he died with HIV in 1985, and he's accompanied me on every important journey I've ever taken since then. So, of course, he was going to be right there at the beginning, holding Tamu, holding a doll that he made that he then sent to me through the mail, and it was my first Black doll. So there's a lot of stories there.
That is wonderful. And in fact, when a former master's student in the African American Studies program at UCLA, did her master's thesis on that doll company. So when I read this, I just thought, this is not accidental. You know, like, I mean, what are the odds? You know, that was incredible. That's incredible. And so as I'm talking about this kind of Black love, what I want to come to essay is you, and really thinking about Beauregard, your protagonist in your wonderful book, and also his partner, Kia. And what I got from that oftentimes was kind of putting the 2012 spin on Erykah Badu's Other Side of the Game. Work ain't honest, but it pays the bills, and his journey through that. And also her journey, and connecting to what Nikki just said there, that oftentimes just because they're straight, people sort of maybe assume that they're in the middle, you know, they fit in. But instead we're reading about these Black lovers who are outcasts of sorts, and they're kind of outcasting together. They meet each other. He already has a kid. He's a teenage father, and they get married and so on and so forth. But so much of the novel, while it's about, you know, his ability to try to hustle for his family, there's this undying love story between those two people. And I would love to hear you just talk about how you embedded that straight Black love story that had that danger in it, that work ain't honest, but it pays the bills, but also familiar. Like, I feel like I know Beauregard and Kia. They might actually be my cousins, you know. How did you infuse that into the book?
I wanted to talk about Black love in a way that wasn't trauma porn. I wanted to talk about Black love in a way that wasn't the usual Sturm and Drang, you know, that I think in fiction, especially in Black well, let me rephrase it. I think in fiction, when people come to Black fiction, they have certain expectations that have been given to them by society, that it has to be, you know, this biblical this biblical torture, this almost over the top suffering. And I wanted to talk about Beauregard, Bug, and Kia in a way that was joyful and happy and connected. At the same time, I wanted Kia to be the person that kept him honest. No one knows you as well as somebody who's seen you naked. And so I wanted her to be his conscience. I wanted her to be the person that did not accept his, I'll phrase this kindly, his BS. Beauregard is a strong character. He's a powerful character. He's a strong Black man. But at the same time, this Black woman who loves him, make no mistake, she loves him. Because she loves him, she will hold him accountable for his mistakes. And so I wanted to have this love story in the middle of this heist novel. I didn't want Beauregard to be a player. I didn't want Beauregard to be a kid who didn't appreciate his Black woman. I wanted them to be a unit. At the same time, I wanted her to be the strong woman who loves her husband, but loves her children, and is not going to allow him to destroy what they built because of his own hubris, because of his own issues. And so for me, it was very important to show them as a couple. And if I could just, for a moment, I wanted to speak about what Robert and what Nikki were talking about. You know, the idea in Black America that there is a conservative movement within the Black American dysphoria, within the Black church. I grew up in a small Southern town, and, you know, if you were in a small Southern town in a Black community, the only way you could be gay and be okay is if you could lead a church choir or if you could do hair. Other than that, they didn't want you to be the full version of yourself, you know, and that was the thing that always bothered me. And I had a relative who was when we were kids, we all knew he was gay. And it didn't matter to us. You know, he was our cousin. We loved him and we cared about him. And a few years ago, he, at 42, finally came out to his parents because everybody else knew. We all knew. And, you know, it wasn't a positive experience. And that inspired my next book. That inspired my book that comes out in July, Razorblade Tears, which is about these two fathers, one Black, one white, whose sons are gay and are married and unfortunately are killed. And these two men, you know, for lack of a better word, these two prejudiced men, these two homophobic men have to deal with that homophobia and have to deal with how it kept them from their sons. And the thing that kept driving me when I write about Black love, when I write about the Black experience, is that love is love. And it doesn't matter whether it's queer love, straight love, as long as somebody loves you and somebody cares about you and somebody worries about you and somebody texts you, did you get home all right? And somebody checks on you, did you get something to eat today? Those are the things that are important. And I think a lot of times in the Black community, there is this unfortunate level of homophobia that exists within the Black community that is accepted to a certain extent in areas. And I really wanted to push back against that. I really wanted to push back against that idea. And so whether I'm talking about Beauregard and Kia and straight love, or I'm talking about Isaiah and Derek, the sons of my two main characters in Razorblade Tears, and their love, and in their love actually having a child together and trying to live their life, I'm always talking about the positivity of love and what it means to us as Black people, as people of color, as people who are forced sometimes to live on the margins. And so that's incredibly important to me, and it's incredibly important to my work.
Thank you for that. And, you know, I want to come to you, Danielle, in part because I think that you also visit with all of these variations of love, because as you were saying, in the short story format and that genre, you're able to tackle things along the way and put it together, like you were saying, as an album. And there are two that I really want to ask you about, but you can take this in whatever direction you like. But I was really curious about the kind of self-love and the journey of self-love and awareness that we read about in the book's opening story. And then also with the complicated family pattern and family love that we read about in Alcatraz. And I thought, particularly with the Alcatraz, such a very fascinating and deeply provocative way to really think about criminal justice reform, think about incarceration and this kind of ancient vestige of incarceration, and also the way you use the kind of like visiting locations and tourism as a way to visit with some of these concepts.
Yeah, no, I was feeling bad listening to everyone else talk because everyone else was like joy and positivity, and I was like, I don't ever have enough of that in my book. Sometimes things just go wrong, you know. But I think that I am interested in. I am interested in the difference between agency and loneliness because I think we don't always know, and I think I'm especially interested in that for Black women because I think so much of what's expected of Black women in partnership is a kind of endless caretaking. And so setting a boundary can be a kind of self-love. Setting a boundary can also be kind of isolation. I don't know that it's always entirely clear which is which. And so I think that's something that in a couple of the stories in the collection, especially that first one that you mentioned, is the question, right? Like, is this character protecting herself or is this character shutting herself off from things? I don't know that she knows, right? Is this survival or is this depression? And I think that's a question. I think that idea of history and the way that we are haunted by things is, of course, throughout all of the stories and the way that we are and are not able to kind of share that with other people. And so I am interested in those weird spaces, like that Alcatraz kind of tourist trap that the first story takes place on a replica of the Titanic. This sort of, it's a kind of preservation of history that also erases it. And one of the other stories in the collection, I'm interested in the question of passing. And I was interested enough in it that I actually taught a class on this last semester because I was trying to figure out what the passing novel is doing kind of back in the 21st century, because it makes sense to me why it shows up when it does in its kind of earlier forms. Not to say that it ever entirely went away, but it feels like it's sort of back in the conversation after a period of relatively long absence. And so I was thinking about that and thinking about the history of the passing text. And so, of course, we also talked about the way that passing texts are queer-coded and the way that passing texts are sometimes explicitly about queerness. And my students were sort of wrestling, I think, with the way that they create both a record and an erasure of the past, right? Because there's a way that you can sort of capture the command to perform, but also there are things that sort of don't make it onto the page in some of the narratives, or even in just some of what we know about the writers' lives, that we can sort of, it's dangerous to reverse engineer from the writing to tell the story of someone's life. And yet there are these sort of gaps in the records, sometimes deliberately created by people whose job it was to maintain those records, sometimes just because they were sort of never recorded. And so I am thinking about all the time kind of what we know and what we don't, what we know because somebody told us, what we know is kind of inherited history, and all of the ways in which we might have 10 different versions of a story, none of which are entirely true.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And to come around, I'll share a little something that I've been up to. For the last 4 years, I've been working with Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She wants to create and establish the U.S.'s first Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission, and a sort of take on what is popularized in South Africa as truth and reconciliation. And when I was reading each of your work, I really loved how each of you used the genre to get after the truth, but from the Black perspective. And I wanted to see if each of you didn't mind sharing, what that journey was like and what truth did you happen upon while you were in that journey?
I'll start.
We'll start with Robert. Oh, okay. I'll say, go ahead.
Oh. No, please, Robert, go ahead.
Oh, okay. The late, great Toni Morrison once said that fiction isn't fact, but it is truth, and that sometimes facts can get in the way of truth. And that's such a hard concept to sort of parse, but I knew intuitively, I knew what she meant. Because when I'm writing this novel, I had no proof that a Samuel and Isaiah existed, but I had a knowing that they existed. And that is kind of how I parse it, is that I am using my imagination to imagine things that whatever systems or structures erased. And I'm trying to put that back onto the page so that we can have a fuller understanding of ourselves as human beings, as a civilization, a fuller understanding of our history, of the ways in which we err and the ways in which we can repair. So for me, it took a ton of research to sort of stitch together what I could in terms of creating this narrative. Although as I began writing the book, so maybe I started in 2006, the book took me 14 years to write. Maybe midway through, I realized that playwright Danielle Love wrote a play called Sugar in Our Wounds that had a very similar topic about two men enslaved who are in love. And then, as I mentioned before, I found out about William Dorsey Swann toward the end of that, like in 2019. And so I realized that it was confirmation that my gut in this case was in fact God. And so it was leading me to a truth that was buried. And like an archaeologist, sometimes writers have to operate that way. We have to dig and dig and dig until we find the treasure.
That's beautiful. Essay?
I think the thing that I learned writing Blacktop Wasteland, and I'll just give you a real quick overview. Blacktop Wasteland started out as a book. It was me trying to articulate a certain perspective of the Southern Black experience, a modern Black experience, the modern Black experience in the South, beset by poverty. But what ended up happening was it became a catharsis for me, and a catharsis about my own hangups with Black masculinity, with toxic masculinity, tragic masculinity, with my relationship with my own father, who I dedicated the book to, because we didn't always have the best relationship. But I'm so blessed that he's still alive and we got to repair the relationship. And I loved him and I learned from him that no aspect of life is strictly black and white, no pun intended, that there are always shades of gray, that there are always nuances to each experience. And so I got that gift from my father by learning his side of the story of the dissolution of the marriage between him and my mother. And so I learned that neither one of them were lying, that the truth is what you see, the truth is what you experience. And so for me, it was the truth of what that means to be a Black man in the South. And it allowed me to untie this millstone from around my neck that I've been carrying for 30 years. And so the thing that I learned from Blacktop Wasteland is that pain makes us make certain decisions, and that pain also makes us who we are. And that if you persevere through that pain, you come on the other side of joy. You know, Beauregard is a character that changes from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. And that, you know, that once you take ownership of your pain, then you can experience the joy that's been waiting for you all the time.
Y'all are some beautiful people, okay? I mean, this is beautiful. Danielle, I'll ask you the same.
Yeah, you know, I'm thinking again about how important storytelling is and has been in all kinds of forms. Even though there's the story that is closest to historical fiction is about a fictional historical event, and also like a common enough historical event that I didn't feel like I needed an exact thing to map it on, I try to do as much possible research to kind of fill in just the gaps of time and place. And so I found myself going through like 20 years of microfiche of the Milwaukee NAACP and kind of looking for the Black newspaper at the time. But, you know, the paper, there were months, sometimes years, when the paper didn't print because it didn't have the funds to print. And then not all of the existing issues that ever were printed were preserved adequately and are available. And the microfiche kind of skips years. And so there are some really clear, there's this hilarious ongoing fight between the regional director of the Milwaukee NAACP and like the sort of guy from the Chicago office who keeps trying to get them to have a baby contest, which I think is like some kind of pageant. And the Milwaukee director is like, do you know what I'm dealing with? Like, no. And there's this like correspondence that gets increasingly hostile. And so there are things that sometimes you get a really clear narrative, but then there's lots of things that are just missing, right? There are these mysteries. There's a question of like what happened to $5 that somebody supposedly mailed in that comes up again and again and never gets answered. And there are whole like months and months that there's no documentation for whatsoever. And of course, even then you're only capturing like a small slice of life. And so I think just knowing people that you can ask to fill in those gaps, right? That's where so much of the history comes from, because it wasn't always preserved in any formal way. And so some of what I got when I was looking for concrete detail was a reminder of the importance of the kind of more nuanced and abstract and kind of human narrative record of history.
Thank you. And Nikki, I'll come to you.
One of the things that I'm thinking about right now, having listened to us for the last hour and thinking about this new book that I have out, Love Child's Hotbed of Occasional Poetry, which is a book of ephemera. It's a book of letters. It's a book of poetry. It's a book of things I call hotbeds because I'm a gardener. And a hotbed is where you put a seed in the ground and watch it grow into a plant, and then you move it to that particular place. And so for me as a poet and a writer, the hotbed is my journal book. Hold that thought for a minute. When this first started, there was a commercial on. Malcolm Gladwell was in a commercial, and it hit a thought of mine. I was listening to him on a podcast last week, and he said this thing that I can't get. It's like a ticker tape in my mind right now. He said, "Black skin to white eyes is an accelerant."
Lord have
and he said, because of that, Black people don't get the opportunity to live the full spectrum of humanity. Because everything is hurried up. Everything is like joy, right? Or pain. But in the middle, there's this beautiful garden in the middle full of all the things Danielle's talking about, that quirky stuff that white publishers used to say, that's not Blackness. I can't publish that. But in this day and age, writers like Danielle are like right to the moon about it. S.A. is doing the same thing. Robert is doing the same thing. So in this moment of Black literature, in this moment of generational, of Black writers doing generational kinds of things, yes, Black skin, as we know today, and what happened yesterday in Minneapolis, is still in an accelerant to white eyes. But to us, Black skin is a pot of honey. Black skin is trouble or a fight with your mama. Black skin, that middle ground is our humanity. And that's what I see Black writers in 2021 really putting their pen and computer on that notion. And that's what I see going out into the world. And that's what I see being celebrated, is all these things that we have never had the chance to write about because nobody would publish them. 400 years ago, Black hands were cut off if you wanted to read a book or wanted to write or wanted to do something other than be a slave. So we've come a long way. We've still got a long way to go, but just think about all the things that we haven't written about yet that we are writing about slow by slow. It takes some time to catch up from 400 years when they exclude you from that. So that Black skin is an accelerant to some people, but Black skin is also home to us. And we are exploring that in our poetry, our short story, our fiction, and even in our magical realism. Gotta give a nod to that, and to Afrofuturism, right? Those categories that are Octavia Butler, gave us so much while she was here. And I just have to call her name since we are talking about Los Angeles.
Amen.
As we say in the culture, the doors of the church are open. Essay, I see your hand. I'll go to you, and then I have an audience question or two I want to pose to the panel.
I just gonna say real quick, I didn't know how much time we had left. And when Nikki spoke about Octavia Butler, I just want to say real quick, this has been such an incredibly invigorating experience for me. As a crime writer, Black person, crime writing convention, crime. The only
Yeah, SA, you're breaking up a bit, so I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you at the end, but
I just because my mom recently passed, but I had such an incredible sense of oneness in this place right now. I just want to thank each of you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. And for all of the folks with us, thank you for being with us and enjoying the Zoom University experience. These things tend to happen, as we've all learned during this pandemic time. I did want to ask, there's a question here from Maggie from the audience, and she asked the following: would you please share transitions or transformations you have experienced in your writing career related to the level of transparency and truth that readers have been able to receive and accept? So it's sort of an extension of what I was asking here, but if there are different points of transition or transformation in your career that you would like to discuss in relation to Maggie's question. Thank you, Maggie, for your wonderful question. I'll send it over to Robert.
You know, what I was surprised about, I was terrified to write this novel because I knew that I would be coming up against a particular subset of the Black community or of Black communities that we sometimes refer to as the Hoteps, who would have seen what I was writing as some sort of quote unquote gay agenda, another subset who might have seen it as sinful, another group who might have seen this as, why do you want to dredge that up? And so I was very terrified to write this book and assumed that the position of the people who I wanted to read this book would be one of resistance, one of negative criticism, and one of disbelief. But that actually was not my experience at all. For the most part, the experience that I've had with the reception of this book is that the very people that I thought would be adverse to it were actually accepting. So that was a surprise. So I don't actually have the story of where readers were not able to accept a particular kind of truth that I was trying to get at, because all of my characters in my book, whether they are the enslaved or the enslaver or from the time before, I tried to make as rich and as dimensional as possible so that they could be complicated and complex human beings and not caricatures. So even the plantation owner has a bit of complexity, because I wanted to answer the question for myself: what would make a human being look at another human being and say, I see nothing? And so I did not have that experience where I received a pushback from readers, at least not in regard to the truths I was trying to expose.
Thank you for that. Next question I have is from Masozi, and she asked the following, and I'm going to pitch it over to Danielle just to give you a little heads up. How do you prepare yourself with negotiations and discussions with publishers, editors, etc., who you know lack credibility in working or respecting work from Black and African-American writers such as yourselves? So I'll pass that over to Danielle for your thoughts for Masozi.
Yeah, I mean, I think my first answer would be ideally you don't. And I know that that's a hard line to draw and also have your work reach an audience, but I think it's getting easier. And I think that there are publishers and editors and agents who can ask around and talk to people have handled things irresponsibly. And there are other, you can sort of see who's putting out books that you respect and also putting them out respectfully, putting them out in a way that seems to sort of take them seriously and position them well for attention and being a part of the literary conversation. And so I think that you want to have an agent who understands that as something that's important to you, right? You want to have an agent who's not just like, well, who can we get to publish this, but who can we get to treat it and package it in a way that understands what it is. And that doesn't mean, obviously, even if you have, a Black editor, there are probably going to be things you have to explain and defend, that doesn't mean you're going to find a place where your work is just sort of taken entirely on its own terms ever. But I do think that sometimes we think the agency is both the sort of antagonist, and I mean, the industry rather has this antagonistic space that we have to enter. And I think you don't have to enter the most antagonistic parts of it. I think you can sort of relieve yourself of that duty and say that if somebody is really insultive or dismissing in what they're saying about your book from the outset, then you really don't want to sell your book to that person, no matter what the other terms, right? You want somebody who's representing you, who understands your project, and you have the right to ask questions. They ultimately work for you. And so I think that empowering yourself in that way is important. Kind of reading the landscape and seeing, even if it's a smaller press or a smaller agency, who's doing the work that you feel good about is important. And then I think being able to articulate to yourself what you're doing is important. And that comes back to I've taught for a long time, and I went to a lot of writing workshops. And my very first day of graduate school, my first professor, Elizabeth McCracken, said, if you're in a really good workshop, if 15% of what you hear is useful, the question is which 15%? And I come back to that a lot, like which 15%? Like how do you learn to hear responses to your own work and reject what's not about what you're actually doing? And I think that a lot of that for me has come to just being able to describe my own project. Not the longer I teach, the more value neutral I become, and being value neutral about my students' work has enabled me to be value neutral about my own work, to read a draft of something and say, okay, this is what this is. And that clarity can help me understand what I need to hear and what I need to push back against in editorial conversations or suggestions. And so I think having that sense of your own work, when you take it into a space where you feel reasonably heard, can help you participate in that conversation about it.
Thank you for that answer. And I'll bring that same question over to you, Nikki, as well, because I know in Love Child's Hotbed of Occasional Poetry, you share a letter from an editor regarding your work early on, and they're kind of waffling about how niche poetry as a market might be. I wonder what your thoughts are on that same question.
Yeah, it was intentional to put that letter there. I want people who want to write to understand it takes muscle. It takes not, the thing I love about writing is the more I write, not dabble, not write in my journal, not take notes on something, not do research, but write. The more I write, the more audacity I have about my writing. Not arrogance, audacity. The more risk I take, the more I understand what I'm doing, the more architecture can come under this thing that I'm working on. But if you're playing with it, or if you're talking about writing, or if you're on a Zoom call for the rest of your life describing it and not doing it, then you don't have the muscle that a writer needs to do the work that they want to do. Morrison said, I write the books I want to read. I'm like, that's it. For me, I wrote Love Child because I wanted to read it. So I went through the ephemera. I went through my father's letters. There are poems in this collection that have to do with a 14-year-old boy in South Carolina being the youngest human being ever electrocuted, ever put in an electric chair, and made to sit on a Bible before they killed him. The book has at the beginning Ralph Waldo Emerson quote next to a Sandra Bland quote. I said, nobody is gonna allow me to do that, right? I couldn't have done that at 40 or 30 or 20. But the more you write, the more you understand what Ralph Waldo Emerson is saying opposite in perpetuity to Sandra Bland. And so just like Danielle was saying, if you can see the clarity in your architecture and in your design, if you know what you're doing, and then you can describe that to somebody else, to me, that's more than half the battle. That's the whole process.
Thank you so much for that. And lastly, I'll pass it to Essay to see if you had any thoughts on that same question as well. Okay. All right, cool. So that brings us to the end of our time together. I do want to thank Robert for being so beautifully brilliant. I want to thank Danielle for being so provocative, insightful, and necessary. I want to thank Nikki for being the legend and giving, kind, beautiful human being you are, and you are for all of us. I want to thank S.A. for bringing crime fiction into the future, into the present, so that we remember that the glorious work of Chester Himes continues. It is not over. The record is not over. The marathon continues. And for those who are familiar with the church, I told you the doors were open. And there is a scripture that I learned many, many years ago when I was a kid that I like to edit and insert Blackness here, given our panel, Blackness across genres. I can do all things through the Blackness that strengthens me. Thank you so much, S.A. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much, Nikki. Thank you so much, Robert. And please remember to support your local bookstores and check out Book Soup for a copy of all of these authors' books and signed book plate. We thank you for being with us during this time, and we really hope to see you soon. Keep reading, and you guys, please keep writing.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Good to see you.
See you.
Oh, sure, yes. And for those who noticed that there's just a foursome here, S.A. lost power and was not able to continue here, but we thank him so much for being here. And I really want to offer my deep congratulations to him on this wonderful novel. As he mentioned to everyone here, Blacktop Wasteland, please get a copy, please read it. And we thank him so much. Okay, and thank you everyone for being here. And we, with that, we bid adieu.
Bye, you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Peace.
Thank you.